All presidents have their good and bad days. All presidencies have their successes and failures. To call somebody's presidency a failed presidency is a pretty serious thing. And it's not something that you usually can tell about right away. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that civics is usually oriented towards the structure of government and the politics of the day. So, in that sense, it resembles political science. The problem is, as intense as the politics of the day are, we have no perspective on what those political controversies are going to mean in the long run. That, the interpretation of long term consequences, is the province of historians. Historians can look back and say, whoa, that was a disaster. Because historians can look at the long term effects of certain decisions. In terms of US presidencies, there are two presidencies that stand out as major failed presidencies. The first is that of James Buchanan, who is the last president before the American Civil War. There's a hint there. The last president before the American Civil War. It is the presidential election right after him that's going to elect Abraham Lincoln, who's going to scare Southerners so much about the possibility that he'll take away their slaves that they secede, fire on Fort Sumter, and begin our bloodiest war in American history. Buchanan basically was like the old legend of the Dutch boy with his finger sticking in the dike, the large dam-like structure that keeps the sea out of Dutch farmland. Buchanan tried to just ignore the slavery controversy, which was literally about to rip the country apart. He tried to keep everything quiet, and he did this because he didn't think that there was an easy solution. And there wasn't, because we fought our bloodiest war over the issues that were ripping the country apart in Buchanan's time. Buchanan's presidency is considered a failure because he did not take effective action to prevent the Civil War. Whether anyone could is an open question, certainly worthy of debate. But it is true that Buchanan did nothing definitively to make anything better. In fact, his inaction gave the poison in this country a chance to really blossom and grow, so that by the time it was time for Lincoln to take office, the country was beyond repair. It needed to rip apart and fight to either stay independent, in the case of the South, or fight to reunify the Federal Republic, which is the cause of the Union. Another president who's considered a failed president is Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1928, began his term of office in 1929 at a time of peak American prosperity. Hoover had been elected because he was not only a millionaire businessman, at a time when being a millionaire meant something, at a time when the American dollar had at least 100 times the buying power it has today. Hoover had also saved the lives of tens of millions of Europeans. After World War I, Hoover set up an international food relief organization which sent food to the starving peoples of Europe, starving after the debacle of the First World War. Hoover also got rid of the communist regime in Hungary in 1919 by refusing to ship food into Hungary until so long as the communists ran things. And ultimately, they stepped away, and the people of Hungary got fed. Hoover was a brilliant guy, and it wasn't because he wasn't smart that he failed. Early in his presidency, in his first October, in October of 1929, the American stock market collapsed. Suddenly, the country lost a third of the value of all wealth that had been there just a few weeks before. It's just that everything was assessed at a lower value. Within 2 years, one wage earner in four, over that actually, over a quarter of the American workforce was not earning a paycheck. That means a quarter of the American people were facing starvation because there were no welfare programs. Now, Hoover decided that it was a economic cycle problem and that doing nothing was the right answer, allowing the economic engine to right itself. What you'll learn when you learn about economics is that economies respire. They inhale, they exhale. They inhale, those are times of boom where lots of money is being made and lots of people are employed, and then suddenly they exhale, and there are recessions or depressions where suddenly the extra gear that's been built and the extra wealth has a correction and everything comes back down to earth. Hoover saw this, and I think rightly, as a massive correction that if you leave it alone will correct itself in a couple of years. The problem is this correction was facing a quarter of the American people with actual starvation. My grandfather knew a family who starved to death in Vermont in the early 1930s. A family in America starved to death. But it wasn't just those people who were unemployed. There were about another 25 to 40% of the people beyond the lower quarter that didn't have jobs that were underemployed. And so everyone, the massive majority of the American people, had an existential fear about where their next meal was coming from. Whole families, whole communities were uprooted. This was a storm bigger than anything we have faced in terms of economics. And Hoover's choice not to do dramatic action was seen by the American people as a deep failure. Instead, when a bunch of World War I veterans came to Washington to demand the money they had been promised as war bonuses, Hoover ordered General MacArthur to send the cavalry in to drive these veterans out of Washington by force. This also was an unpopular decision. Hoover was trying to prevent what he thought was the seeds of a communist revolution, and he had some reason to be concerned. But his decision to use our army against our war veterans was deeply, deeply unpopular. So after Hoover came Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, like him or not, was effective at getting the federal government to start employing all sorts of people and trying to stimulate the economy. There are many people who give Roosevelt credit for ending the Great Depression. I don't. There are many people who believe that Roosevelt's policies deepened and lengthened the Depression. Personally, I do, but I could be wrong about that. But what is undeniable is that Roosevelt helped the people be brave as they faced this crisis, and he helped a lot of people stay alive who might have starved because he set up a series of federal aid and work and welfare programs. And that is what most Americans who were afraid at that time wanted. What makes a failed presidency is not rising to the occasion, not rising to the challenge of the moment, letting a problem fester and get worse. And both Buchanan and Hoover, it's not that they did the wrong thing, they did nothing. And in doing nothing, they did worse than doing the wrong thing. When you're in a leadership position, you're always afraid of making a decision that will make things worse. But sometimes you've got to make some kind of decision because doing the wrong thing is better than doing nothing. Sometimes. In both cases, these presidents refused to definitively act. They didn't do the wrong thing, they did nothing, and the country got much worse as a result. What makes for a successful president is the opposite of that. Successful presidencies are not perfect. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was successful. Ronald Reagan's presidency was successful. Because, right or wrong, the president became a leader, and the president inspired people to join with him in the Congress, in the military, in civil society, in business, in the courts, to face the challenges of the time and to bring us together as one people. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's what we often need to do when the chips are down and when times are hard. The president is officially in charge of the bureaucracy but competes with the Congress because the Congress oversees the bureaucracy. The president has to deal with the Senate and the House of Representatives as a co-equal branch of government who raises all the money. The president has to respect the courts while trying to influence the courts to be friendly to his decisions. Sometimes the courts go along with what a president wants, sometimes they undercut. Usually it's a little bit of both. But the president must respect the judiciary, the court system, and if the courts say no, 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 the president has to find another way. The Congress also has to find another way. The judiciary, the courts, led by the Supreme Court, and the Congress, the legislative branch, are equal branches of government. The president is not the boss of them. They are equal and they are supposed to work together, all three of these groups. That is designed by Montesquieu, by the Founding Fathers, inspired by Rome, to keep anyone from having too much power. The president is not the boss of the governors. Governor Little of Idaho does not work for the president of the United States. But a wise governor will try to work with the president and the Congress to get federal aid, and a wise president will try to cooperate with as many governors as are willing to do so. So often, presidents of both parties meet with the governors, and they try to encourage the governors of their party and of the other party to work with them on certain common issues. The president has very little to do usually with municipalities, but with cities like New York that have 8 million people. 8 million people is 8 times the population, more than 8 times the population. Actually, it's about 16 times the population of the state of Wyoming. So with certain cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Boston, the president does interact with the mayors of those cities. The president has interest groups that support his election, like the National Rifle Association for President Trump and the American Civil Liberties Union for President Obama, but you cannot be a creature of those interest groups. You've got to work with the interest groups that you're allied with, against the interest groups that you don't, but you've always got to keep the dignity of the presidency beyond reproach. You cannot be seen as a creature of any one interest group. Finally, American citizens and the presidency. American citizens are honored by the president when they are recognized for doing amazing things. Presidential Medal of Freedom is something that the president can give out to civilians. The president can recognize success. And if you look at any State of the Union speech over the last 20 years, you will see the president point out people who they've invited to the audience who represent heroism or virtue of some kind. And this is a way for the president to look out at the population and say, look at what these particular people have done. That's an amazing and awe-inspiring thing. It's inspirational. A president's power is not dictated strictly by the Constitution. A president has very limited powers by the Constitution, but a president that's able to persuade the people, inspire them, lead them, can move a Congress that's friendly or unfriendly on the important issues of their day. Above and beyond everything else, a president must be a dynamic and inspirational leader, as well as a wise steward of American blood and treasure. He cannot be too easily upset, but he cannot be too placid either. Every president finds his own way towards success. They're all trying to succeed. Some achieve it, some fail. And as you all had your presidential research project, I'm going to talk briefly about what I want you to know about each of them in the last video of this week.